Hello there. We do appreciate you all signing in for this event. This is the first of 4 history events. The first and third will be content-based lessons, and the source-based lessons will be the second and fourth sessions, okay? So I'm going to start by introducing you to Mr. Barclay, who's going to deliver tonight's session on Germany. Thank you, Mr. Barclay.
Okay, thank you, sir. So thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you're all doing well at this time. So today we're going to focus a little bit on Unit 1, Germany in Transition. So this takes place over around 1919 to 1939. Okay, so the reason we're doing Germany in Transition, the reason I decided this is probably a good thing to cover was, for me, I think it's arguably one of the most important periods of history to learn from. I think looking back, it's certainly a period that we reflect on, and we realise the dangers and the importance of studying history. Secondly then, if you do, or if you've already opted to take history at A-level, you're highly likely to study Germany as one of your topics. Okay, it's one of the most popular units that is studied, so it's obviously very useful there to have that background knowledge to take you forward. Okay, so what to expect in this, just in this one session, okay, is an overview of course content. So I will go through a fair amount of the actual module itself. I'll go through a little bit of exam technique, but the focus will be on course content, knowledge and understanding, and then change over time are your second order concepts. So around this content, I would like us to to build it around a question. Now, this is a past paper question, a genuine past paper question from 2019, I believe. And the question says, use source A, and this is source A on the left, this picture, and your own knowledge to describe how Stressman dealt with Germany's economic problems. And that's a 6-mark question. Now, I'm not going to tell you just yet what this picture is of, or I'm not going to go into any detail of it, because I want to start at the beginning. Right? To understand this, we do need to go right back to 1914, 18, and the period just shortly after. Okay, so if we start in 1919 and then up to 23 roughly, obviously World War I took place between 1914 and 1918. Wars, as you can imagine, are very expensive affairs, and whichever side you're on, I mean, it's a huge expense. Ultimately, Germany lost, and Kaiser Wilhelm, this man in uniform here that you can see on the left, he ended up abdicating, which means that he stepped down, and he actually fled then to the Netherlands, just to sort of safeguard himself from any repercussions. Germany then became a republic, which is just a fancy word for saying a country run by the people, right, as opposed to by the monarch. For example, the United Kingdom is not a republic. Okay, there is a monarchy, but Germany then was no longer an empire; it became a republic. Okay, so it's run by presidents and chancellors and so on. So not everybody was happy with this, with extremist groups on both ends of the political spectrum taking issue with the Weimar Republic. Okay, so we've got 2 presidents here. First of all, between 18 and 1925, we've got Friedrich Ebert. Okay, he's the first president of the Republic. And then we've got Paul von Hindenburg, who was in power between 1925 and 34 until his death. So some of the problems then that Germany were facing after the war, I've already said that money is a problem for any country really that goes to war, but particularly for Germany and their side of things, there were big problems as a result in terms of punishment that they faced for their involvement in the war. So a problem Hindenburg had was that he placed chancellors in power who they didn't represent the most popular parties. So what that meant was that they weren't really able to affect change. In a short space of time, there were 9 elections. So in 1923 and 1932, there were 2 elections in those years, which is, it might not sound like a lot, but it really is a lot. I mean, if you look at our electoral system here, we only have a vote once every 4 years. So you can see there that that's a problem. They've got no stability, no economic stability, no political stability. Article 48 gave people emergency powers, which would essentially be a big problem for Germany going forward, in the sense that people were able to abuse it and claim that there were emergencies when they weren't necessarily, just in order to make things happen. The proportional representation as a voting system was also an issue. So parties were then given seats based on proportion of total votes received. It was therefore difficult to gain a majority. And now when the Nazis ended up coming into power, and they had the biggest share of the seats, they only had something like 37%, I believe. So you can see that that's not a majority. That's not enough to effectively change things and to shape things as you as a party would like to do. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles was, I suppose, very significant in actually causing a lot of Germany's problems over the next 10 years or so. It was signed in 1919 for their involvement in World War I. They had no choice but to sign it. As a result, the conditions were that Germany was to lose 13% of its land. This was usually in the on the west part of Germany, the Rhineland and the Ruhr, which we'll get to shortly. The army was limited to 100,000 men. They were banned from owning tanks, heavy guns, aircraft, and submarines. And they were limited to ships of less than 10,000 tons. So this really does cripple Germany's army, and it really does embarrass them. It makes them small, essentially. And then reparations of 6.6 million. Okay, so huge numbers. And a way of remembering this, you may have used different acronyms in your schools if you've studied this, or you might have heard other ones, but one I like to use is land, army, money, blame, or LAM. Okay, so one of the punishments, of course, was that they lost 13% of its land. Army was a big problem. It really reduced the size of the army. Money, then they had to pay reparation, and they also, in terms of the blame, they were blamed for the start of World War I, and they had to shoulder that blame and accept it. So with hyperinflation then in 1923, okay, this is caused by the Treaty of Versailles. Basically, Germany ended up having to print more and more money just to kind of get by, and what that ended up doing was lowering the value of that German currency. So Germany then couldn't really afford reparations, and it was made worse by the loss of land, particularly in the Ruhr. And you can see this yellow section in Germany here. It was really important for Germany, the Ruhr, because it was an industrial area, it had coal fields. It would have meant that Germany could have had more jobs and therefore more money, and also being more self-sufficient. However, that wasn't the case for them, because they were prevented from doing so. It got to a point where French and Belgian troops actually invaded the Ruhr in order to retrieve the money that they were owed and that Germany weren't able to pay back. And then blame was directed towards Weimar. So there's a lot of resentment, and you can see up here. I'm hoping you can see behind I've got a toolbar up here which says presenting, but I'm hoping you can see behind that, and it says there what the inflation is. Okay, so it really does rise quite a lot. So nearly 1.5 million marks was only equal to £1 in July 1923, and then in November this skyrockets. Okay, so this was the source, and this is the one I didn't want to give you any background on at that point. But this is source A, right? And we'll unpick the question a little bit together later. But this is then a picture of a German woman burning money, for the simple reason that it burns for longer than firewood. So it's essentially cheaper to burn money for warmth than it was to burn firewood. Okay, so things weren't all doom and gloom, though. It did get better. As the title, The Golden Years, suggests, there was a sort of period of real prosperity and optimism in Germany, where things were really looking up. Okay, so Stresemann was a financial worker for Germany, And he worked to improve Germany's economic position, which of course was at the forefront of everything in Germany at this point. It was responsible for everyone's happiness, I suppose. The quality of living was poor. Having to burn money rather than wood obviously suggests that quality of life is poor and things aren't secure. So what Stresemann did was he signed off on the Dawes Plan, okay, arranging loans from the United States, which were obviously really important, allowed them to start paying back their reparations, and also the demilitarization of the Ruhr. He organised for the French and Belgian troops, which we talked about on one of the previous slides, to leave and therefore be able to use them to be more self-sufficient. He also launched the Young Plan. So reparations were reduced to a more realistic figure, 1,850 million, and extended repayment time to 59 years. Okay, so that's really important. He actually, I think he reduced reparations there by 5 or 6 times, and obviously made it a bit more achievable for Germany. It wasn't crippling them so much at this point. He then also introduced the Rentenmark to replace the previous mark, which was really weak. As you saw, people were burning it for warmth. And the Rentenmark was a lot stronger, people had more trust in it, and the value started to come back to the German economy. So the effect of this then, the economy improved significantly, but not completely. Okay, when you're relying on loans, nothing is really secure, as we'll find out shortly. But things were on the up, they were looking positive. Okay, so it also improved relations with other countries. They've got this sort of positive spin now with USA and France and Belgium as well, where France and Belgium aren't breathing down their necks, and the United States are working with Germany, which obviously wouldn't have happened otherwise in the time of the war. Okay, so as well as this, as well as the economic position, women ended up having more freedom. So they had better access to jobs, they were allowed to vote, and in some jobs they had equal pay to men. And we know this to be a problem still today, so that's all a positive step, and this is all quite forward thinking. There was political stability, so in bad times people tend to support radical groups such as the Nazis, but because things were looking a bit more positive, people don't tend to look for the radical groups. They tend to trust what's happening, so there's a bit more trust towards the Weimar government at this time. There was also more housing, which again is a sign of a strong or certainly a strengthening economy, and there was unemployment insurance to protect those who were without jobs. So we said about this question before, and what I'd like to start with is just unpicking this question. All right, so when we see a question, what I like to do is underline certain aspects of it. But to start with, when we're reading this, okay, we need to underline the following. I think I've missed a bit out there really as well. I think we should also underline source A, because we need to use that picture, we need to refer to it. We don't need to talk about it in a huge amount of detail, but we do need to talk about that source. We also need to refer to our own knowledge. If we bring our own knowledge, we're really going to add some context and information and depth to that source. I've also underlined describe. There is a difference between describe and explain. Describe being quite clear and concise, whereas explanations mean you end up sort of having to add things on and really go into detail. But describe, there's no real great detail that's going to be asked of you in this question. We're also then, I've underlined Stresemann, okay, because it's important that we're talking about this particular period. We do need to be talking about this period of the golden years and what Stresemann did, Gustav Stresemann did, and how he dealt with Germany's economic problems. We're not talking about Australia's economic problems. We're not talking about Germany's political problems so much, although that might have an impact on it. We're talking about economic problems. Okay, we need to make sure we're focusing on that. And again, it's 6 marks. So the mark scheme, right, so for band 2, if I just start over this side, because when you're writing this, you should always start with the source to introduce and to set the scene, I would say. So with AO3 then, it's worth 2 marks. Okay, that's the breakdown. It's worth 4 and 2 marks. The 2 marks for the source, and it says accurate analysis of the source set within its historical context. And then for AO1, this is where you build in your own knowledge. Do you demonstrate detailed understanding of the key feature in the question? So how I like to approach this. Okay, I've already said that we should underline the question. We should read it, we should underline it, we should highlight it, we should do it quickly. But we should certainly do that just to make sure that we're focused on the right aspects of the question. It's so easy to talk about the wrong thing or to go off on a tangent which isn't going to get you marks, even if you do know your stuff. Secondly then, study the source. What can you see? What can you infer? And to infer is to make inferences, which means to read between the lines. What can you see without necessarily seeing, if that makes sense? Okay, what does it tell you without necessarily directly showing you? Reading between the lines, I suppose, is the idiom which would describe that best. Then what I like to ask is, why is this event happening? Okay, and that's where you bring in your own knowledge. That picture doesn't tell you why the event is happening. It only shows you a German woman burning money, and the description says because it's cheaper than firewood. But you need to think as well about why the event is happening. Okay, and that's, like I said, your own knowledge. And what happens next? What is done? What is the response to it? 3, if you then bring in your own knowledge. So what do you know? What does this mean? And what happened after? And as it's a 6 marker, I would personally aim for 4 fully developed points. Okay, so this is a model answer. All right, so just going to read through this. So it says source A shows a picture of a German burning the old German mark as burning money became cheaper than burning firewood due to the hyperinflation of 1923. Now that's all I've said for the source, and I'll go through a little bit in a second what went well, what didn't go so well in this, and you can kind of see that. So in a first step to overcome Germany's economic problems, Stresemann replaced the old mark with the Rentenmark, creating a more secure currency and gaining the confidence of the German people in the currency. He secured the withdrawal of French and Belgian troops from the Ruhr coalfields by agreeing to start repaying reparations, giving Germany greater control over its assets. While agreeing to repay reparations, Stresemann was able to persuade the Allied forces to accept significantly lower reparations payments through the Young Plan, which had been crippling Germany's economy until then, as well as extending the repayment period to 59 years. He negotiated the Dawes Plan with the USA in 1933, which allowed Germany to repay as much as it could afford each year. Now, I've deliberately made a mistake in there, and I wonder if anybody can spot it. I'm just going to give you 10 seconds. I know I can't see the chat at the minute, but I wonder if anybody has spotted the mistake. I will tell you what it is in a second. Obviously, I can't communicate with you at the minute, but perhaps if you put it in the chat and Mr. Penny can let me know if anybody got it before I've said it. Otherwise, you can just be quite smug within yourself that you got the answer right. Okay, so in terms of what went well, okay, so I've started off straight away with a reference to the source, right? Just straight away, source A shows, right? It's just really short, really brief what I've said about source A, and that's going to secure me the 2 marks. Okay, I've said what's happening in source A and why it's happening, 2 marks straight off the bat. I've then started this off with, in a first step to overcome Germany's economic problems, it shows a focus to the question. It's a direct response to that question. I've also, on the whole, used clear and concise points. So I haven't really gone into too much depth, explaining too much, although I think I have in some places. And we're going to go through the marks quickly, and then I'll show you what went well, even better if. Okay, so the mark I've given this, and I also sent this to a friend who teaches history elsewhere, we agreed that this is probably 5 out of 6 marks. It was a 6 marker, but the reason it's only a 5 out of 6 was because of this, right? So if anybody got that, Diane, well done to you. But you need to make sure that if you're going to put the date in there, it does need to be correct. Okay, if I go back to the mark scheme, where it says accurate analysis of the source set within its historical context. If I'm talking about 1933, about an event which took place in 1924, it's the wrong historical context. Okay, so it's just something as simple as that which can make the difference between 5 and 6. But yeah, Hopefully there's somebody in here who managed to spot that, but don't worry if you didn't. So in terms of what went well and even better if, and I've already highlighted what went well. So I've just noticed a mistake there on my green box there. I've put the same point in there as I meant to put on the right side. So what went well there was that it was clear, concise information. I've referenced the source and brought in my own subject knowledge. The bottom bullet point, if you just ignore that for now, it's actually a target for improvement. So if I wanted to improve this, of course, my first one would be to get the specifics right, because that would mean that I would get my 6 marks out of 6. So if I say 1924, not 1933, then that secures me the full marks. But also, I'd say a way of improving that is to say what it led to. What was the impact of it? Okay, I very much talked in short terms in terms of what happened in the first instance, but I haven't said what happened as a result. So, okay, so I could say about more housing, women having more freedom, more rights to vote, unemployment insurance, political stability. I've also explained a little bit in places, but there's no need. Okay, just state the facts, make 4 points, maybe 5 if you want to, just to be sure, and if you've got the time, and move on. Okay, so then that takes us up to, just checking the time, there we are. Okay, so that takes us up then to the rise of the Nazi Party. So despite Streseman's success, much of Germany's economic recovery depended on loans. All right, and as I said earlier, a country which depends on loans, a person who depends on loans isn't necessarily very secure financially. Okay, you're depending on other people, and this is where Germany and I suppose the golden years certainly came to an end. It wasn't necessarily Germany's fault. However, the reliance on loans meant that they were in trouble. So in October 1929, there was the Wall Street crash. Okay, so this meant that America was kind of in a similar position to Germany back in 1923 with hyperinflation, where the dollar became quite worthless and money was short and food was hard to come by and so on. So times were tough and depression hit. So when I say depression hit, that's to say a financial depression, not sort of mental state. That's an actual event there, okay, the depression. So, I can't say, I'm gonna have to come out of full screen so I can see this. Hopefully you can as well, if I just scroll up a touch. There we go. Right, I'll go full screen once I've said the first one, because I couldn't see it with a pop-up over it. But after the golden years then, Stresemann had just died and German people did not have a leader that they could trust to solve this new crisis. Okay, and that's a big thing in politics. You need to have someone you can trust. And if you don't trust anybody, that's where people start turning to the radical parties, like I said earlier. And we'll touch upon that a little bit later. But obviously, if you've got someone there that's making good things happen, you tend to just go with the flow, don't you? It's kind of one of those things where if it's not broke, don't fix it. But as it was, things were breaking, they were unraveling and falling apart. International trade began to fall and factories closed, creating unemployment. And this was a huge problem in Germany. Obviously, it had been a problem years before, and it was to become an even bigger problem again now. So in 1932, there were 6 million unemployed Germans, meaning 4 in every 10 workers without a job. So that's nearly half. And then falling food prices hit farmers hard. So obviously, basically with farmers trying to sell their food, people were paying less and less for it. And obviously farmers there weren't making as much money, whereas in hyperinflation, they had been making quite a good bit of money because the price had gone up. The price of the market had gone up, that is. So many people could no longer afford their rent and ended up homeless. And then the government paid out unemployment benefits, which again, it's good that they're being supported, but it doesn't point to a secure country economically and financially. And then more money was needed to spend on this, even though the government was getting less in taxes. I suppose you can compare that a little bit to what's going on today with the furlough scheme and everything, with with the government just needing money just to pay people who aren't able to work at the minute. And it was the same sort of situation back then in 1929. And there was talk of benefits cuts as well, okay, because the government simply could not afford to keep up with them. So Hitler, ever the opportunist, he started to wise up, I suppose. He'd had his Munich putsch back in the 1920s, which had failed. He'd been arrested, went to prison, and he'd had time to think, basically. He'd gone from wanting to overhaul the government through violence and through a putsch or through overthrowing them, and actually wanted instead to take the more democratic approach. And he did this quite cleverly. It was kind of a game to Hitler, I suppose, and he played just about every step perfectly. It all just kind of fell into his hands in terms of how he got into power. So as I've said, radical times breed radical thoughts. When times are good, you want to go with the flow. When times aren't so good, you really want something that's really going to change things up. Okay, it really is going to shift things and make things improve and change the sort of direction that the country was going in, which of course at this point was all downhill, wasn't it? So Hitler travelled then all over the country giving speeches and blaming Germany's problems on particular groups, for example, Jews and communists. He of course promised to do things about these problems, and as we know, he did do things, horrible things about these problems. He was also, it has to be said, a brilliant, he was a brilliant orator. He was really good at giving speeches. He knew what to say. People would come from all over. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people would come to watch his rallies, his speeches, just to hear him speak. He really had this incredible figure when he was giving speeches. He also received financial backing by heavyweight industrialists such as ThyssenKrupp and Bosch. You may know Bosch. Still it's quite a popular brand today for their electronics. And it wouldn't have been possible without that financial backing. So in May 1932, the Nazi Party, as I said earlier, received 37% of the votes in an election. Now, this was the year where there were two elections, and obviously 37% being the highest number really points to a problem, I think, in the Reichstag being the German political home, I suppose, much like the Houses of Parliament are the political hub in the United Kingdom or England, certainly. The Reichstag is the German one. So 37% isn't enough to really do anything. If you try to pass a policy that you want to enact and everybody else wants to play hardball, then they can vote against you, and therefore nothing is possible. Of course, there's Article 48 as well, which was manipulated. However, this would have meant, or should have meant, probably, that Hitler would have been Chancellor. That was usually the done thing. Whoever has the most goes in as Chancellor underneath the President. So, but Hindenburg did not trust him at all. Hindenburg is the figure we can see here on the right, and then Hitler with his head bowed. But he didn't trust him. But on 30th of January 1933, he became Chancellor due to failure of previous Chancellors to form a working majority. So it's kind of, that kind of came about a little bit as well as the Vice Chancellor at the time, von Schleicher, had told Hindenburg that he thought he could control Hitler, and obviously that wasn't really the case. In terms of consolidating power then, which means to establish power and to hang on to it and really firm up that power, Hitler did a number of things, and a lot of things again played into his hands. It really was a stroke of luck, and also quite a good bit of planning in a responsive sense for Hitler. So Germany then became a one-party dictatorship, also known as the Third Reich, between January 33 and August 34. In 1934, there was the Reichstag fire, a picture of which you can see on the right. Hitler called another election, during March of that year to further establish his power and control. Obviously, 37% was nothing really. It was enough to be the biggest party, but not enough to do anything. So he wanted to try and get some more votes, and he'd been really pushing for more support. So a week before the election, on the 27th of February, the Reichstag was actually set on fire, and a man called Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested on suspicion of starting the fire. He was a communist. Okay, so this was then used to spark fears of communism in the country, which would make certain people want to rally behind the Nazis. They'd be so fearful of communism as a power and as of taking over. So the aftermath then of this was that Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Decree for the Protection of the People and State. Okay, so this is Hitler now using these events to his advantage. He was given powers to restrict free speech, limit freedom of press, and imprison enemies without trial. And I mean, you've gone from 0 to 100 here. It's really radical what's going on. And what you can see is political opponents are being silenced. They're not allowed to speak. If you see here, free speech, not allowed. Freedom of press. So what's in the press is being controlled by Adolf Hitler. So it's not going to have anything which speaks out against the Nazis. It's all going to be supportive. And of course, imprisoning enemies without trial. So a lot of communists and people from other parties would have been put into prison or concentration camps. So communist and socialist newspapers were banned. So if Nazis are right wing, communist socialists are left wing. So anyone on the other end of the spectrum, they're not being heard at all. He passed the Enabling Act, sparking the end of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed him to control press, ban political opponents. So in the Reichstag, there were no political opponents. There was only one party, the Nazi Party. Trade unions were banned, so strikes were made illegal, so people couldn't really protest. And he also purged the civil service, which prevented Jews and political opponents from holding certain positions within service. This was then to create a position of Gleichschaltung, which is the creation of a true Nazi state. He had power over everything. Okay, what time are we? So 5:03. We've got about 5 minutes left. Another way Hitler consolidated power in terms of purging enemies was through the killing of a number of SA guards, and most notably Ernst Röhm, this man here on the left. So he was the leader of the SA who had helped Hitler establish power. They were essentially like an army who had, I suppose, terrorized people in Germany to, one, stop them speaking out, and two, to make them, I suppose, even just outwardly support the Nazis, even if in their minds they didn't necessarily do so. I suppose just to conform to the Nazis and to accept them, I guess, out of fear. So he felt, Röhm, that he deserved to be rewarded with incorporating the army into the SA and wanted a social revolution ending Germany's class structure. So the SA was demanding that the Nazis introduce major social change, but Hitler was worried that the left-wing ideas would alienate the groups he depended on most. For example, the middle class, businessmen, and industrialists. The SA had 2 million members and wanted to take over the much smaller army, which would have increased their power. And Hitler didn't want to annoy the military because it could overthrow him, and he needed them to cooperate with his ambitious foreign policy. Of course, if you're planning on invading certain countries in a few years' time, in 5 years' time, then of course you want the military on your side, don't you? You want them to fight for you and to support you, and you want them to think that you've got their back, and that was what Hitler did. So he believed that the SA was the only group that could stop him achieving a true dictatorship, and that Gleichschaltung that we spoke about just a moment ago. On 30th of June 1934, Hitler ordered the SS, which is the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's personal bodyguards, to murder approximately 400 people, which were political enemies, and that was including Röhm. Hitler justified this by accusing the SA of being homosexuals, so that was his justification for it, that they deserved to die for that reason. After this then, in August 1934, I mean, this is where I'm talking about events playing into Hitler's hands. Hindenburg died. Okay, and Hindenburg was really weary of Hitler, and he really didn't trust him at all. And when he died, it kind of signaled Hitler becoming Führer. Hitler declared himself Führer, which is like the all-out leader of Germany. Presidents and chancellors were done away with, and Hitler was the Führer of everything. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to talk a little bit while we've got the time about life under Hitler. We might not be able to go through all of the points, but we can certainly cover some of it. So in terms of work, Hitler, kind of like Stresemann, improved the economy. And he did this by making it compulsory for men aged 18 to 25 to serve manual labour jobs for 6 months. So that would have counted towards Germany's employment figures and therefore reduced them. They also built 7,000 or over 7,000 kilometres of autobahns, which is a motorway, planted trees, hospitals, schools and houses, or built hospitals, schools and houses. They didn't plant them. And that created a lot of jobs. Okay, so people without jobs would have been sort of brought into these services, and obviously people are getting money, they're being paid for it. And of course, the Autobahn improves the transport around the country, again, improving the economy. So rearmament, Hitler kind of tore up the Treaty of Versailles and said, actually, no, we're going to rearm, we're going to have weapons, we're going to have an army, we're going to have soldiers, we're going to have strength. And that's what he did, which again creates jobs. Promoted a policy of autarky, making Germany self-sufficient. For example, extracting oil from coal is a really good way of making yourself self-sufficient. Like I said about unemployment falling, it fell from 6 million in 1933 to 350,000 by 1939. Now, this is kind of a false figure because Jews weren't counted in this figure because a lot of them were actually kicked out of their jobs, like I mentioned with the civil service, and women were also dismissed from jobs as well. So that was because as well, I'm weary of time, so just to develop on women being dismissed from their jobs there. Nazis, unlike Stresemann and the forward-thinking role that Stresemann had, they saw women as domesticators. They felt that women should be at home, looking after the home and looking after children, bringing them up, and cooking and so on. Very old-fashioned views, but obviously we can see there that it goes backwards. They then replaced trade unions with the German Labour Front. Like I said, they banned strikes, and obviously they had control over pay then, the working hours and so on. They launched the Strength Through Joy, or the KDF, which improved leisure time by sponsoring holidays and concerts, and many more. There was also a Volkswagen scheme in 1938, which allows workers to save 5 marks a week to pay for their car. And can you imagine that at this time? I mean, you've gone through a time of economic crisis, and suddenly you're able to buy your own car and save up for it weekly. Yeah, so just to go over women very quickly. So they had traditional attitudes and reversed many of the forward thinking policies. They saw men as decision makers, while women were responsible for the home, bringing up children. They promoted the 3Ks. I'm terrible at pronouncing them, but they basically stand for children, church, and children. So there was the law for the encouragement of marriage in 1933, which entitled newly married couples to a loan of 1,000 marks, of which 250 marks could be kept when they had a firstborn child. Is they're really encouraging people to have babies and to get married because they wanted to grow the population. There was also then, just finally, the Lebensborn or the Lebensborn program in 1936, which encouraged an increase in birth rate among racially pure Germans, the Aryan race with the blonde hair, muscular, the pure Germans, as they put it. So that's it from me, because I'm conscious of time and you may need to be elsewhere. But thank you very much for listening, and all the best.